Okay, we need to talk about what is going on with US-Europe relations right now. So back in February, I kept seeing this headline about this German state that was moving away from Microsoft. And at first I assumed it was just sort of cost saving, but then France did something similar. Then the European Commission announced cloud sovereignty funding. And so I decided to look at the polling, and suddenly it stopped feeling like coincidence and really made me think, okay, there's actually something here. So polling from Pew Research Center and Ipsos shows double-digit declines in favorable views of the US across multiple European countries. The Munich Security Conference's latest security index found that a growing share of Europeans now describe the United States as unpredictable and in some cases even a direct risk to their future security. So that is definitely new. So when I look further into this, it really seems that European governments and institutions have finally begun deliberately reducing their dependence on American technology companies. So I don't think it is a lot of fun being a US citizen abroad right now. I think it can get pretty uncomfortable because over the past 5 years, a measurable shift has taken place across Europe in how the United States is perceived as a partner, as a stabilizing force, and a steward of global systems. So obviously this is because of politics and power, but I think we all know that the behaviors of politicians and governments, they do reflect on the citizens of those countries. So as I just mentioned, Pew Research Center's 2025 cross-national survey on views of the United States shows double-digit declines in favorability across many European countries compared with pre-2020 baselines, with especially sharp drops in Germany, France, Spain, and Italy. So trust in the US president and confidence in America's ability to do the right thing in world affairs, they both fell significantly across the whole continent. So Ipsos's global reputation tracking shows a parallel pattern. Between 2023 and 2025, the share of respondents in major European economies who believe the US has a positive influence on the world declined hugely. The European Security Conference's 2026 Munich Security Index found for the first time since the index has been compiled that a substantial portion of European respondents, they described the United States as a potential risk to their country's security. Eurobarometer data shows a similar erosion of confidence, while Europeans still report stronger trust in EU institutions than in most national governments. Trust in the United States as a strategic partner has weakened sharply since 2019, with notable deterioration after 2021. Okay, so polling is one thing, as many people point out when I talk about opinion polls and all that kind of stuff. People often just say it's subjective and it really only tells you the mood or the feeling, which can change quickly. And so it doesn't really mean that much. But I think the speech from J.D. Vance in Munich was not appreciated. And Europeans are also deeply troubled that US tech billionaires are getting involved in European politics. And it's just very difficult to take a pro-US stance in Europe right now. A lot of bridges have been burnt. And I'm talking about the politics, not the people. But I do wonder, if you are an American living abroad, if you've experienced any negative backlash just because you're American. So aside from all of that, it's not just politics and rage or opinions and emotions. The more important signal is what European institutions are actually doing with their money, with infrastructure and long-term planning. So across multiple member states, governments are no longer treating American technology providers as default options for core public infrastructure. So we already mentioned Germany's northern state of Schleswig-Holstein committing to migrate tens of thousands of public sector workstations away from Microsoft Windows as part of a long-term digital sovereignty strategy. So France has also replaced Microsoft Teams and Zoom across large parts of its public sector administration with domestically developed video conferencing software, again, framing the move around data control, security, and strategic autonomy. At the EU level, the European Commission has launched a 180 million cloud sovereignty tender designed to support European cloud infrastructure and reduce reliance on non-EU hyperscalers, like Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud. The EU is also in the midst of an intense internal debate over the European cybersecurity certification scheme for cloud services, with proposals explicitly aimed at limiting the role of non-European providers in high-sensitivity government workloads. So this is really all about sovereignty, and something you might not have known is that the US government can legally access data from US companies, even if those data centers are built on the sovereign territory of another state. So what is emerging slowly but unmistakably is a shared institutional conclusion that dependence on US-based technology firms is a strategic vulnerability. And so this is a profound change from the post-Cold War assumption that American technological leadership and European stability were naturally aligned. That assumption rested on three beliefs: that US domestic politics would remain broadly predictable, that American firms would operate primarily as commercial actors, not geopolitical ones, and that technological power would diffuse rather than concentrate. So none of those beliefs now look secure at all. A small number of US companies control a huge share of cloud infrastructure, of mobile operating systems, social platforms, and advanced AI model development. So at the same time, US law allows American authorities to compel those firms to provide access to data under certain conditions, regardless of where that data is stored. So from a European perspective, what this means is that large parts of Europe's administrative, economic, and informational life, they run on systems governed by another country's legal and political environment. Just think about that for a moment. Imagine if the roads, the railways, and the airports were built and maintained and managed by a foreign government. That would seem like a massive strategic vulnerability, or not? So a large part of Europe's unease is not emotional at all, it's legal. So in 2018, the United States passed the Clarifying Lawful Overseas Use of Data Act, or the Cloud Act. In plain terms, it just basically gives the US authorities the power to compel US-based technology companies to provide access to data under their control, even when that data is stored on servers outside US territory, provided there are certain legal thresholds which are met. So for European policymakers, this really creates a structural problem that just never goes away. Even if a European government hosts its data in a European data center, even if the servers are physically located in Frankfurt or Paris, if the service provider is legally domiciled in the United States, then US law can still reach into the system. So quite frankly, from a sovereignty perspective, this is an existential question. And up until recently, the US seemed to be a friendly and supportive ally, so Europe wasn't really thinking much about it. It basically means that European public administrations, hospitals, tax authorities, and ministries could theoretically find themselves operating on infrastructure that sits inside another country's legal perimeter, which is just wild. It really throws the whole idea of nation states, of borders and democracy into question. Or am I missing something here? This tension has been discussed repeatedly by European data protection authorities, national courts, and the European Data Protection Board, particularly after the collapse of the EU-US Privacy Shield framework following the Schrems ruling by the European Court of Justice in 2020. So that ruling effectively stated that US surveillance law does not provide protections equivalent to EU fundamental rights, making routine transfers of personal data to the United States legally precarious. And so what this means is that US cloud services are widely used, they are dominant, but their legal status is really kind of not particularly clear. Even large public sector cloud contracts, they now exist inside a zone of latent legal conflict. And this legal layer intersects directly with the second, more recent shock of artificial intelligence, because advanced AI systems are not just software. They are built on extreme concentrations of compute, specialized chips, and energy-intensive data centers. And the overwhelming majority of advanced AI training today relies on hardware designed by NVIDIA, manufactured primarily in Taiwan, although ASML in the Netherlands does play a key role as well. But they are integrated systems largely controlled by US companies. At the same time, the US has imposed sweeping export controls on advanced semiconductors and AI-related technologies, using access to chips as a geopolitical instrument. So from Europe's perspective, this sends a very clear signal that the future productivity gains of AI and future gains, economic growth in general, will depend on access to infrastructure that sits inside a supply chain ultimately governed by US strategic priorities. So it means that Europe's next wave of automation and industrial optimization or digital public services, that can be throttled by decisions taken in Washington, not in Brussels or Berlin. So while a lot of people are arguing about the EU, not many people have stopped to think about the stranglehold that US big tech has on Europe. Even if relations do remain friendly, even if no one intends any harm, dependence of this magnitude, it just changes how power works. And to be honest, I'm kind of just hoping that someone in the comments will correct me and tell me that I'm over-exaggerating the situation or that I've missed something. Because US, through US big tech, basically, they have access to all of European data. And I'm not talking about social media. We're talking about health records, about company secrets, innovation, data protection, tax data, essentially anything that is stored on a US cloud service provider. It really introduces a massive asymmetry. And I mean, thank God, it does look like the EU has realized this. So if you look at European documents, increasingly they use language of strategic autonomy or de-risking and things like technological sovereignty rather than decoupling or confrontation. So this is not about a confrontation in a kind of emotional sense. It's really just about sovereignty and de-risking, as they keep talking about. So the goal is really not to replace US technology across the board, because that's obviously very unrealistic. Most European officials, they admit that this is just not possible. But the goal is really to ensure that the most sensitive layers of European society, like government data, identity systems, health records, defense infrastructure, those kind of things, that at least they are somehow shielded from US big tech. So if this reality is as severe as it appears, then the European reaction looks more like a slow motion recognition of a structural mistake. I mean, wasn't this obvious 10 years ago? Like, surely you could have seen this coming. Did we really have to wait for Donald Trump to wake up to this structural reality? Like, there have been several documentaries made about how social media run by American big tech companies have influenced or changed election outcomes. So it seems to me that this is really very long overdue. And this really does matter a lot, because the platforms that Europe has relied on, they're not just tools, they actually form the channel through which society operates on. And I think we tend to forget that. Like, cloud infrastructure decides where data lives and whose codes can reach it. The operating systems and app stores, they mediate access to work and services and communication, and social media platforms shape the emotional climate of politics long before parliaments even begin to discuss an issue. And they also change how society functions and how people relate to each other. In essence, they are changing the social fabric of society globally, not just in the US. Modern Europe built a large portion of its post-war identity around constraint, procedure, and legal architecture, because the continent learned painfully and repeatedly that the state, moving quickly and with ideological clarity, can become extremely dangerous. And that lesson is embedded in institutional codes, data protection regimes, and the slow friction of due process. These are often experienced as frustrations, especially when the world moves faster and other powers appear less encumbered, but they are also a form of collective self-control and a deliberate attempt to ensure that power remains accountable, contestable, and domesticated by law. The problem is that platform power grew in a way that bypassed many of these mechanisms. It expanded transnationally, consolidated into a few companies, and became embedded in everyday functioning of institutions before politics had found a language to describe what was happening. This is why the sense of unease now feels deeper than the usual argument about regulation. So what Europe is increasingly confronting is something much more fundamental. The possibility that the core channels of modern life, in essence, the digital nervous system of society, that may now sit permanently outside European accountability structures, while still shaping European society from the inside. And that is not a good place to be. That is essentially how you abdicate your sovereignty without going to war. So underneath the policy language of sovereignty sits a psychological fact that is very easy to miss if you treat this as a standard transatlantic spat. So trust is what makes dependency feel like a partnership. When trust weakens like it has now under this US president, that dependency starts to feel very much like a liability, even when nothing has maybe gone wrong yet in an obvious sense. Europe can argue about immigration or fiscal rules and identity in national politics all day long, and yet still find that many of the most consequential levers of modern life are being set by entities whose incentives and accountability structures do not map neatly into European democratic expectations. And so for a long time, Europe behaved as if history had ended, as if the basic architecture of the world was settled and that all that remained was to manage it more efficiently. Security would be outsourced, technology leadership would be imported, growth would come from elsewhere, and Europe would specialize in rules and standards and social programs. But what we are now seeing is the first serious sign that Europe no longer believes that arrangement is stable enough to build a future on. And so it's begun to accept that a civilization cannot permanently outsource the foundations of its own functioning and still expect to remain a meaningful political entity. So I don't see this as Europe turning against the US. I see this as Europe turning back towards itself, towards the idea that infrastructure is power, that sovereignty in the modern world does not begin with flags or speeches, but with who owns, governs, and controls the systems that organize everyday life. Europe may still fail to build ecosystems with the scale and dynamism that the United States has done. It may be too slow, there may be too much compromise, but the direction itself does matter because for the first time in a long time, Europe is behaving less like a museum of past greatness and more like a political entity that understands it has a future to defend. And so in the kind of world we are drifting into, that may be the most European form of self-assertion possible. What do you think of US big tech? Do you think they have too much power? What should Europe be doing to ensure it remains and retains its sovereignty? Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoy these takes on Europe and personal finance, geopolitics, you might want to check out this video here next. Otherwise, please like the video, hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.